Welcome, and we will, of course, start off with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And I'm going to share the screen. What is that? So this is something that Shoftim is famous for, and that's here. Ki tavo el haaretz, when you come to the land, asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach, which the Lord your God is giving to you, v'yirishta, and you inherit it, v'yeshavta ba, and you dwell in it, v'amarta, and you say, of course it means, and you think, right? You consider, asima alai melech, I shall place a king over myself. Kachol hagoyim asher sivivotai, just like all the other nations that are surrounding me. And by the way, implied in this is a criticism, even though there's no direct criticism in the Torah. But the truth is that the Jewish people are only supposed to have one king, and that is the eternal king. But nevertheless, it's interesting. So there's an accommodation to have an institution because other nations have that institution. So I think, let me look and see. Yep, there's no Rashi on this. Sum tasim alecha melech. You shall indeed place upon yourselves a king. Asher yivcha Hashem Elokecha bo, which the Lord your God chooses. So in other words, the suggestion here is the only king you can in fact elect as a king or establish as a king is one which God has chosen. And in the book of Samuel, we read about how God chooses Saul, and also how God chooses David. And Samuel, the prophet, is the one who makes that selection. And it's actually the selection of David, the story of the selection of David is very, very interesting, because Samuel actually doesn't realize who's supposed to be the right king. And when he goes to visit Jesse, Jesse has several sons. And in fact, David, who's the youngest, is out shepherding the flock. So he isn't even around at the time. And every time Samuel wants to select this particular son, God says, this isn't the right one. And he goes through all the sons that are there, and God says, this isn't the right one. And so he has to turn to Jesse and he says, do you happen to have another son? Well, that's when they get David in from pasturing the flock. It's a very lovely story. So, and even the election of Saul is also an interesting story. Let's see, make sure yes, all right. Sorry, let me finish this up. Mikerev achecha tasim alecha melech. Literally from the heart of your brothers, you shall place upon you a king. So let's keep going. Lo tuchal, just to emphasize what is meant here, lo tuchal latet alecha ish nochri, you are not allowed to place over yourselves a stranger, a man who is from outside, asher lo achicha who is not your brother. Onwards. By the way, that's one of the reasons why when King Herod was not Jewish, not of Jewish extraction, and it's considered, there were all kinds of miserable things that happened through his reign. Again, complicated. Life is complicated. However, right? The word rak is a limitation, right? Rak lo yarbel lo susim. He should not multiply for himself horses. So he shouldn't have many horses. Velo yashiv et ha'am mitzrayma, so that he doesn't cause the people to go back to Egypt. Leman harbotzus, so as to multiply the number of horses he has. Vashem amar lachem, whereas God has said to you, lo tosifun lashuv, you shall not once again return baderech hazeh od, in this way ever again. So there's a reason, right, given for this particular mitzvah. And I'll comment on that a little bit later. Oh, Lauren, I'm sorry. Yes.
Well, I mean, it may be something related to what you were going to comment about later, but I was just asking, are we not allowed to visit Egypt?
No, that's not what we're talking about here. So I don't believe there's I'm not aware of any prohibition to visit Egypt. The idea is going back, and of course, the way they would have gone would have been through the Sinai Peninsula to go back to settle there. Although we know there was a Jewish community in Egypt, still is, I'm sure. A lot of them went, the origins of that community was at the destruction of the first temple. They actually forced Jeremiah to go down there. They went down there to escape the Babylonians. So I'm sure there's other stuff written about it, but certainly just visiting Egypt should not be a problem. You have no intention of staying there. And as long as you're not going to buy your horses there, right? I suppose that would be part of it. So here we go. Lo yarbel susim. He shouldn't multiply his stable. This is in Sanhedrin. Ella kedei markavato, but only according to his chariots. Shelo yashiv et ha'am mitzrayma, so that he doesn't send the people back to Egypt. Shahasusim misham, because horses come from there. Kama ne'emar bishlomo, as is mentioned regarding Solomon. So if you look at the first book of Kings, chapter 10, you'll see that Solomon will, and again, I said I would comment on this a little bit later, Solomon did multiply enlarge his stable, and he did, in fact, send people back to Egypt to get more horses. And there it says, V'ta'aleh v'teitze merkava mimitzrayim, and it came up and went out, the chariot went out of Egypt, b'shesh me'ot kesef, at 600 silver pieces. That's how much a chariot cost. V'sus, and a horse cost b'chamishim u'me'ah, 150 silver pieces. So they mentioned, this is to support Rashi's contention that the horses originate back there. Apparently that's where they had a lot of car manufacturers, right, or transportation development. Onwards, velo yaber lo nashim, he should not have many wives, multiply the number of wives he has. These two specific mitzvot given to a king, velo yasur levavo, so that they don't turn his heart away. V'chesev v'zahav lo yarbel mo'od, and silver and gold he shouldn't multiply for himself very much. So again, no ostentation here in this regard. Let's just we'll finish here, and then I'm going to mention what I said I would. V'lo yarbel mashim, and he shouldn't have many wives. Ella yudchet. How many wives is he allowed to have? 18. He's allowed 18 wives. Well, we read about how Solomon had 1,000, so 18 wives. Shematzinu, that we find Shahayula lo David shesh nashim, that David in fact had 6 wives. V'ne'emar lo, and it was said to him, second book of Samuel, chapter 12, Ve'im ma'at if this is a little, v'osifu lacha kahena v'chahena, I shall add for you like this and like this, or like them and like them. So since he had 6, this one kahena would make 12, and this other kahena would mean 18. That's how we get the number 18. V'chesev v'zahav lo yaber lo ma'od, and silver and gold he shouldn't multiply for himself to a great extent. Ella kadei, so how much is he allowed to have? Enough kadei liten la'achsanya, enough to provide hospitality. And here's the Yiddish word, Gastfreundschaft, right? Guest friendship, hospitality. Sfarim acherim, other manuscripts have a different version of this word. Instead of achsanya, they've got, he says, ispania. And as a matter of fact, I looked this up in Jastrow, and Jastrow says this is sort of a corruption of the word afsanya. It does say afsanya, that is the word, forgive me, afsanya. And it means provisions, Mahlzeit, right? So enough food. So provisions for the army. So that's how much he needs, that much money to take care of all these things. He can have that much money, and I'm assuming it's expensive. So what did I want to tell you? So we notice that these 2 mitzvot have reasons. Right? We're given reasons why the king is not to multiply horses. We're given reasons why the king isn't allowed to have too many wives. And the story goes that when King Solomon saw these statements, he said to himself, I'm smart enough. If I multiply horses, I know I'm not supposed to take some of the Jews and send them back to Egypt. And if I have lots of wives, they aren't going to turn aside my loyalty to God, etc., etc. So he went and he did it. And guess what happened? So essentially, there's this whole question of whether it's a good thing to give reasons for the mitzvot. Because what is interesting is that sometimes when you give a reason for practicing a mitzvah, it actually acts, instead of supporting and encouraging one to in fact perform the mitzvah, because now it becomes a rational enterprise, it actually can work in just the opposite way. And I'll give you a modern example. There are those who say that the rules of kashrut are there because there wasn't refrigeration in the past, and that's why the rules of kashrut were instituted. And of course, now that we have refrigeration, the rules of kashrut no longer apply. I would be honest with you, I think the years have since rolled over that, and now people just don't, people who choose not to keep kosher just don't look for rationales and reasons. They, or excuses. They simply don't. But there is an example of where if you give a reason for doing mitzvot, because I think, there was a natural desire to say, well, why are we doing these things? And I think there is one ultimate reason, and that is because God said so. And because it's part of displaying our trust in God, or working towards developing an active trust in the divine creator, and establishing a relationship, that you don't always need reasons. And I think, the practical application would be in a marriage, for example, where sometimes what you do for your partner isn't because it makes sense or anything like that, but because it's a way to show how much you love them. And in fact, if every time they asked you to do something, you said, well, why do you want me to do that every time? It would be a very unloving way to behave. So it's just interesting here that, the Gemara picks these, demonstrates that these 2 particular mitzvahs that have reasons given attached to them is exactly why Solomon ultimately didn't practice them and then got into trouble. So, V'haya keshifto al kisei mamlachto, and it shall be when the king is sitting, literally, right, when he sits on the throne of his sovereignty, of his kingship, v'chatav lo et mishneh haTorah hazot, he should write for himself this Mishneh Torah. This literally it means second Torah, something like that. Or although it's interesting that the Aramaic here, Patshegen, would mean a copy, right? So that could well be the correct translation of the word Mishneh. He should write for himself a copy of this Torah, al Sefer, on a scroll, milifnei HaKohanim HaLeviim, before the Levitical priests.
Yeah, Chabad says he should write for himself 2 copies of this Torah on a scroll.
Okay, and in fact, that's exactly what Rashi says. So they're dealing with this word Mishneh, which, and by the way, this is another name for the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, it is a translation of the words Deuteronomy, which means second law. That's what the word Deuteronomy means in Greek, and how you understand it. But when you make a copy of something, then now you have 2. So that's why it's interesting how Onkelos translates this into the Aramaic and how he does it. But Rashi is following Sanhedrin, and he says Shtei Sifrei Torah. He says 2 scrolls of the Torah. Achat shehi munachat babeit ginzav, one that resides in his archives, and a second copy which comes in and goes out with him. In other words, which he keeps very close to himself. He travels around with it. For Onkelos, look at this. Rashi's commenting. Tirgem patshegen. Right. He translates it as the word patshega. Patar mishlo mishneh. So he explains the word mishneh, lashon shinun v'dibur. So he translates this having the meaning of studying and speaking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Jastrow. So I'm going to go to here, and let's see if I can find the Jastrow dictionary that looks like it. And we'll look up the word Patshegan.
And Chabad says it means copy, but and they say 1 copy of the Torah, which the scribe would write while uttering the words before he writes them,
Yes.
deriving Mishneh from studying, from or something. And also, I just want to point out that there's a little Rashi before this one too.
Okay, let me see. I didn't see it, but I'll go back and check. Thank you. Let's take a look. I'm looking up the word Patshegan. So here we go. We're getting close now. I hope I can get it. Let's try this. Okay. Huh. Okay, let me see what I can do here. This is, okay, that's funny. Okay, I'm trying to get this up and it's not letting me go up for some reason. No, it's just not letting me go down. All right, let's see if Patshegan is here. Yeah, okay, nope. Let's go to the next page and see. Okay, it should be, here's Patshegan, right here. It's a Persian word, and it means repetition, copy, abstract. So there we are on the Jastrow, right there. And I'll go back to the original share. So thanks, Lauren. Let me go back and see what I may have missed. Oh, yes, thank you. I did indeed miss it. Okay, so v'haya keshivto, right? And it shall be when he, literally when he is seated, right? Imasa kain, okay? If in fact he follows these specific mitzvahs for the king, right, for the monarch, kidaihu, he deserves, right? He is worthy, shetit kayem malchuto, that his reign should be established. So thank you. That's what I skipped. All right. Vahita imo, this second scroll shall be with him. V'karabo kol yemei chayav, and he should read it all the days of his life. Lama'an yilmad, so that he learns the yirah et Hashem Elokav, that to fear or to be in awe. That translation, be in awe, is one that I was reading in Heschel. He's dealing with it there, and I really like the way he actually explains the nature of awe. The shmor et kol, so as to observe or to keep divrei haTorah hazot, the words of this Torah, ve'et hachukim ha'ela, and these statutes la'asotam, to perform them. So, we see it's very difficult to observe Torah if you never study it. And the truth is that the process of studying Torah, and the more you study it, and as you go through it, day by day, month by month, year by year, it starts to have an effect, even from the get-go, so which you can actually comment on. But just being exposed to it can have very great benefits. Levilti rum le'avavo me'echav, in order that his heart not be lifted over, right, exalted above his fellows. Ulevilti sur min hamitzvah yamin usmol, and so that he not turn aside from the commandment, right or left. The ma'an yarich yamim, so that he lives many years, al mamlachto, or that his kingship, his reign, should last a long time. Hu uvanav, he and his offspring, bekerev Yisrael, in the midst of Israel.
And there was a Rashi on 19 too.
Okay, right there. Divrei HaTorah, kamashma'or. The words of the Torah, Rashi says it means exactly what it says. Okay, that the words of the Torah, that's what we're talking about. We don't need metaphoric explanation, I believe, is what Rashi is telling us. Thank you. Ulevilti sur min mitzvah, and so that he doesn't turn aside from the commandments. Afilu mitzvah kala shel navi, even a very light or insignificant mitzvah of a prophet. The ma'an yarich yamim, in order that he lengthen his days literally. Michlal hein ata shomei alav. So Rashi says, from a positive, you infer a negative. So what does that mean? So if it says, if he does these things, he will establish his reign for a long time. So if he doesn't do these things, etc., you can fill in the dots. V'chein matzinu b'Shaul, and so we find with Saul, with King Saul, she'amar lo, to whom Samuel said, Shiv'at yamim tuchal ad bo'i elecha, you need to wait for 7 days until I come to you, ha'alot olah, in order to perform a whole offering, to offer a whole offering, uchtiv, and it says there in Samuel 1, chapter 13, Vayochal b'shiv'at yamim, he waited 7 days, velo shamar haftachto, but he did not keep his promise, lishmor kol hayom, to wait the entire day. And it's interesting because in some ways this is parallel to what happened at Mount Sinai with the building of the golden calf. And but here we're talking about the fact that he waited 7 days, and somewhere into the seventh day, he stopped waiting. And to understand, to give the maximum level of patience on all these kinds of things. V'lo he spik lahalot ha'olah, and he had barely started to offer up. This is Saul, had barely started to offer up the olah sacrifice, the whole offering, ad sheba Shmuel, before Samuel arrived. So he was in the middle of doing this. Saul was in the middle of doing this when Samuel showed up on the seventh day. V'amar lo niskalta. He said to him, "You've made a mistake, right? You've done foolishly. Lo shamarta, you did not fully observe, and you didn't guard, etc. Va'ata, and now, mamlachtacha lo takum, and now your reign will not be established. Halamadata, so you learn, shebishvil matzak hala shel navi ne'enash. So you see that for a simple commandment or simple command of a prophet, the prophet being Samuel, ne'enash, Saul was punished. Who of Anav, he and his offspring, Magid. So this tells us, she'im beno hagun lemalchut, if his son is fit for the kingship, hu kodem lechol adam. It means he precedes anyone else. That the rule goes from father to son, along that way. But it says, provided the son is worthy of inheriting it. So let me put in, this is a good place to stop. And so I will put in the little marking here. Okay. And that's going to go here, but we're actually on the previous page, I believe. Let's try this. And okay, right here. Thank you. And if anyone wants to share anything at this point, let me know. Otherwise, I will stop the recording. Okay.